Paul and Silas bound in jail, had no money for to go their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on.
Dreaming New Worlds. That's the theme of this year's festival. What better way to celebrate the opening weekend than to welcome this group of panelists who will reflect on the changing face of race in America. As we project forward to the year 2050, what will our country look like, act like, feel like? How far have we come since the Emancipation Proclamation 150 years ago, and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech 50 years ago? It was questions like these that prompted Yale Divinity School to devote an entire issue of Reflections, its magazine of theological and ethical inquiry, to the topic of the future of race. Editorial Director John Lindner and Editor-in-Chief Ray Waddell have joined us in the audience. Please take copies of Reflections magazine as you leave after today's talk. The panelists assembled here and others contributed to the extraordinary written conversation alongside renowned African-American artist David Driscoll and photographer Terry Boddy. To continue that conversation today, our moderator is Harlan Dalton. Harlan is currently priest in charge at Christ Church Cathedral in Hartford, and in addition to being an ordained minister, he is a professor of law emeritus at Yale Law School, where his subject areas were civil procedure, law and theology, critical race theory, and law and psychology. He is the author of the book, Racial Healing. In addition, Harlan is a lecturer at Yale Divinity School. In 2007, he was awarded an Elm Ivy Award by the mayor of New Haven and the president of Yale University for his contributions to the city of New Haven. He's also my friend of many years. Please join me in welcoming Harlan Dalton and the panel, and thank you for being here today.
I was going to begin by offering a definition of race, but we could spend the entire hour or month debating that, and let's not. Because whatever race means and whatever work race does, it is essentially a social construct. It's not a scientific concept or construct, and therefore it changes over time. It changes as society changes. It's sensitive to cultural and social changes such as the increased interaction among people of different races or ethnicities, increased social interaction, increased intimate interaction. How's that for a euphemism? Changes in immigration policy, the digital revolution, the shifting role of racial and ethnic subculture in popular culture. For example, hip hop taking over the world and white males in the suburbs thinking they're Snoop Dogg. So there are all these changes in culture which inevitably change the meaning and the significance of race. And at the same time, the meaning and significance of race is constrained by the racial understandings of the past. And that's because our own psyches are shaped by the understandings of the past, and also past understandings of what race means and what it does have been embedded into our institutions. So we've got all these changes that have the effect of altering our understanding of what race is. At the same time, past understandings are deeply embedded as well. So with all that in mind, I'm going to ask you all to predict the future. Okay? Where are we headed? What will race look like 20 years from now, 30, 40, 50? Racial consciousness, racial distinctiveness, racial identity, race as a determinant of value, of power and privilege in society. So since Tisa's the only one who's not looking at her shoes, so let's start with you. They paid me not to go first.
That's what I get for not looking at my shoes.
There you go.
My name is Tisa Wenger. I am assistant professor of American religious history at Yale Divinity School, where I teach a variety of courses in American religious history, including a course every once in a while on race and religion in American history, a course this past year on Native Americans and Christianity, and I've done a good amount of research on the topic of Native Americans and religious freedom in American history. So that's some of who I am and where I'm coming from. Now, this has been said so often that it's a cliche, really, but I'm a historian. Historians don't do the future. We're not very good at prophecy. So that's my little opening disclaimer. But I'll do my best, to reflect on this question. And I think where you started there about race as a social construct was also where I was going to start. So you got me started in a good direction. I think it's very clear in American history that how people understand race and divide up racial groupings has changed so drastically over time. So I think it's safe to say that it will continue to change. One of the things that historians talk about a great deal in thinking about race in American history is the black-white binary as being a primary way that racial difference has been structured. And of course, that has always looked somewhat different depending on what region of the country you're in. Mm-hmm. I've spent a good bit of time living in California and Arizona, where the presence of Native peoples, the presence of Latino and Hispanic people and Asians as well has always been much more visible than perhaps it has been historically in the Northeast and in the South especially. But I think one way that race is changing is that it will no longer be possible for any of us anywhere in the country to think about race exclusively in terms of that black-white binary, because demographics are changing so that other racial minority groups are much more visible around the country. Having said that, I think it's important not to pretend as if that binary does not continue to exist, or to allow the presence and visibility of many racial minority groups to lead us to believe that we have now entered into a kind of happy state of multiculturalism and racial pluralism, which is in fact not the case. Racialized systems of power and privilege continue to structure our lives in this country in many ways. Now, I could keep on talking for quite a bit. I have a lot in my mind to say, but I have a feeling you want me to turn this over to somebody else. Is that right?
In fact, well, Kiati, you're looking at me. Bad move. And so first introduce yourself, and then pick up wherever you will.
My name is Kiati Joshi, and I teach in the School of Education at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Jersey. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. When you ask the question and to prophesize and look ahead, I think about the year 2050, and I think, there's often these discussions that, you're saying 2050, sometimes other dates, years are thrown out, that white folks will be a minority then. As if all of a sudden, abracadabra, we're going to erase 274 years of white privilege and white normativity that's been embedded in our legal system, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And one of the things that I think will affect what race looks like in 2050 is how much we are able to deal with bringing some of the invisible to the visible. Yeah. So how much in the public consciousness can we get more conversations about white normativity and white privilege, and understanding that there are these inherent advantages that are embedded in everyday life. That will affect how we see race and racism in 2050.
I want to ask about the opposite. You talked about bringing the invisible to the visible. I want to ask you about bringing the visible to the invisible. I mean, one of the reasons that race works as a way of assigning value, of assigning privilege, power, is that more or less people can determine visually what race a person is. At least we think we can.
We think.
And when we can't, we get very puzzled, right? It seems to me that increasingly that will not be so easy. At Yale University, the largest undergraduate racial group is the biracial, right? Mm-hmm. So increasingly with intermarriage, or at least with the production of children from different races, whether parents are married or not. Right. Let me put it this way. I once suggested a kind of a thought experiment of a country called Beige, where everybody was sort of a basic variation of beige color. Our kind of features were all more or less the same, right? So let's imagine that 50 years from now, that's actually the physical. We talk about what does race look like. Suppose that's kind of what America looks like, that there aren't such stark variations in physiognomy. It's a little hard then. So I'm saying, well, I used to be black, and I've got all this legacy. Well, that is so. I guess what I'm asking is as the visual changes, does anything else change? What's race look like?
Is this towards me?
You start, and then you pick one of the other two.
Well, I think this is where some of the other factors will come out. For example, religion.
We talk about religion because, what do you mean by that?
Well, religion, the way religion is lived, is often affected by race. And we have the racialization of religion, which is why you can have someone who's brown in America today, and the first attachment put to it is you're Muslim.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't matter what faith you really are.
Right.
I go through TSA, I go through the airports. One day I was leaving my house, and I was going to read this book by Mustafa Bayoumi, which is on Arab Americans, and the cover has Arabic on it. And when I was leaving the house, my husband said, "Do you want to walk through the airport with that book?" I was like, "No, I don't." Right? So that's kind of the other piece of it.
Okay. Aracelis?
Yes, my name is Aracelis Vasquez-Hay. I am the assistant pastor of the La Primera Iglesia Bautista Hispana, the New London, which is the First Hispanic Baptist Church of New London. And I'm also an alum of Yale Divinity School. And I am a child of the Americas. I am multiracial. My parents are from Puerto Rico, and I also serve the Latino community. And when I think of race, I think of just even how, in my community, how we internalize that, and though we are the fastest growing population in America, there is a lot of racism that occurs even with that community. I think of, for example, in my church where, I hear my young girls talk about, yo tengo pelo malo, I have bad hair. What does that mean? And where did they learn that? Or perhaps if, this young girl is dating a black man and he may be a black Latino, there's comments. Or if the fact that someone's dating a white man, oh, he's white, let's welcome him into community. So I think that as we look at 2050, it's important, and I think the task will be for someone like me serving this community, how do we begin to educate and challenge and confront the issues that occur within our community? Because we could grow, but if we're not united or appreciate or welcome difference, then it's going to be the same cycle because we've learned from those who are privileged.
And when you say if we don't welcome appreciate difference. Are you talking about within race?
Within race, yep. Within in the culture that even exists in that community, because that's one of the biggest issues with the Latino community. There's a lot of difference, and a lot of folks who feel as though I don't want to interact with that group because they're from Central America or South America and we're Caribbean, or vice versa. And as we know, in the Americas, there is a huge difference in the race, just in how it's been divided in terms of race within the countries.
So what makes the Latino community a community, given that it's made up of different racial groups, different
Great
nationalities,
question.
increasingly different religions?
I think that's something that has been structured here in America due to the fact that we speak Spanish. Right. And that's just it. Spanish is what unites us. Yes, there may be some difference in terms, for example, if you are comparing the Caribbean, the Spanish-speaking countries, and islands such as Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, yes, there's a lot of similarities in terms of the multi-race culture that exists. But it's very different. I mean, I'm sure that if you were to look at the Latinos in the Northeast versus those that you saw in the Southwest, very different experience.
And then the Spanish itself becomes
and it's very different dialect also.
And with the younger generations, maybe not so much.
Yes.
And they're learning just enough to be able to tell when their parents are talking about them, right?
Because when we look at the numbers, the second and third generation numbers have increased in the United States. So though they may speak the language of their abuelas or abuelos, their dominant language is English. So does that make them less Latino, is the question. And I believe no.
No, I asked the questions. What's the answer? Jerry.
It's interesting that...
actually, say who you are. I know that these are people, but could you just briefly?
It's still interesting. But, my name is Jerry Streets. I'm the senior pastor of the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church here in New Haven, which is the oldest African-American congregational church in the known world. That's because it was established here in New Haven in 1820 by freed slaves and abolitionists. I also was a chaplain of Yale University for 15 years, and I've been an adjunct member of the Divinity School since 1987. Harlan, I've lived in country nation Beja for 63 years. My father's side of the family, African American and Protestant, and my mother's side of the family were Polish Catholic. One of the memories I have of that kind of experience is how at home it was Beja, but in the neighborhood it was considered just black.
Yeah.
And so as we think about our lived experiences and our past experiences and the history of this question of race, for me, I think one of the greatest challenges is for us to have a different kind of language and critique for the role of culture and racism, and not culture and race. The distinction I try to draw for that is that to me, culture is, all the good things we can say about culture, one of the ways culture functions is that it can be a conduit for ideologies, a conduit for perspectives. And racism, for me, is the ways by which we take any aspect of any ethnic community and privilege it or disqualify it over others. So it's not just a matter of looks, it's a language, it's assumptions we make about gender, sexual orientation. And I've noticed over the years how I tend to think and talk about ethnicity more than race, and racism as an ideology that isolates and privileges and sometimes is used to oppress people who carry those characteristics. I'm very much aware of the fact that in some situations, when I walk into the room, my gender and color, as perceived by those in the room, enter before I do as a whole person. And then there's some negotiation amongst the people there, how they're going to fit together what they perceive me to be with how I may be in actual presentation. And sometimes, as a pastor and as a clinical social worker in both of those areas of professional practice that I engage in, I see so many signs of hope, as you indicated about inter-ethnic dating and marriages and that kind of thing. And if you take that snapshot from families who are multi-ethnic in the sense that we're talking about it, to them the world looks like the changing face of race is what they see around the dinner table. And to some extent that's true. But I think we have to allow for the fact that it's not either or, but it's both and. That is, you have this multiplicity of blending cultures and amongst communities, but at the same time, you could have a narrative going on in a larger society that still privileges or takes certain aspects of people and use that as a means of discrimination. And lastly, let me say that just recently, there's in the Chronicle of Higher Education, you may be aware, there's a big article about the makeup of leadership of all the Ivy League schools. Yeah. And it says it's still white at the top. That's the title of the article. I was actually disappointed and concerned about a comment made, attributed to a senior administrator who indicated, my paraphrasing this now, is that for minority people, particularly African American people, opportunities in that genre, for an example, is a matter of fit. Does the person accommodate the dominant culture enough to make everyone who represents those values feel comfortable? My immediate thought was, well, if they do, then what does that really mean? And what happens when you do make everyone feel comfortable, but the ones that you're making feel uncomfortable are still looking at you through the lens of those particularities? So, and how does that get negotiated? And how, in spite of how comfortable you can make people feel, there still is a glass ceiling, because you're not invited into all the assumed conversations, because A, it's the ambiguity. You're making people feel comfortable on the one hand, but on the other hand, the same people that you're making feel comfortable still identify your language, your looks, your gender, out of their prism of history and out of their prejudices that perhaps they have to still work on.
So let's pick up on that last point, and I'll come back to Tisa because you got shortchanged. Everybody on this stage knows how to be a white man, right? And that is to say, we all...
Well, that's only half of me, so I know that.
No, but the women as well. I mean, we all know how to make other people comfortable, make the dominant culture comfortable, right?
Yeah, yeah, we're trying to do that.
The question I want to put to you all, starting with Tisa, is in the future, how much additional room will there be for us to have all of our edges, all of our cultural expressions, all of our particularity on display without somehow feeling at risk?
Well, we can always hope. I wanted to go back first to this issue of interracialism, because of course there is increasing visibility of interracialism and increasing intermarriage, but we all know that it's nothing new, right? As Jerry pointed out already, and I can't help but wonder if some of the sort of celebration of interracialism at a celebrity level might also function sometimes to obscure the ongoing systems, racialized systems of oppression that we call racism. And I don't want to go any further in the conversation without mentioning. So no, I'm going to keep going, but I want to mention, because it's a book that has had immense impact in my thinking, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which I know, we had at the Divinity School as a common read this past year. And she talks about how a colorblind society, in fact, masks a new Jim Crow, which is, she diagnoses as the system of mass incarceration and the drug war that keeps communities of color, particularly African American men, but certainly not exclusively. I mean, the same could be said for, I think, Hispanic men, and illegal immigration is increasingly being tackled through mass incarceration as well. Native Americans are also disproportionately incarcerated. And at every level of the criminal justice system, we know that there is racial discrimination. And that goes on under the rhetoric of a colorblind society that then makes us believe that it's not because of race that, in fact, so many people of color are kept in a kind of permanent underclass, both in prison and through the felony laws that keep them away from full participation in the society after their release. So I think that it's important in any conversation about race, I find, to make that point kind of like a reality check. If we're talking about increasing diversity again, and it's not just a happy picture, let's not allow that conversation to obscure what in fact is still structured in our society. There's huge racial disparities that we need to tackle. I think there are signs of hope in the increasing awareness of this issue that we see in, for example, us at the Divinity School reading this book, and I know there's immense attention to this book around the country in various churches and faith communities. But I don't see that going away. I don't see racism and white privilege disappearing as a result of...
Well, except that you actually made a double point, because you also suggested that the basis for continuing disparities may cease, at least on the surface, to be race, but rather the fact of incarceration.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and it seems to me that's structurally similar to the point that Kiadi was making earlier, that even if judgments about race aren't made based upon color, it may be, yes, but you're a Muslim, or based upon religion, so some other factor that's tied with race, or that historically was very much connected. So even, I guess the point I'm getting from the two of you is that even as race itself, on the face of things, becomes less salient or less visible or less obvious, or just way more complex, thanks to Kim Kardashian, then never mind. It doesn't mean that disparities in life prospects, in possibilities, fade away. I mean, but let me ask you, I want to come back to Kiadi and Araceli. I want to distinguish, I mean, Jerry did it between culture and racism, but I want to make kind of the same point between kind of the internal experience of identity and what's described by society. Because I suspect that both of you spent a lot of time fighting. Well, I shouldn't say I suspect, having read your essays. I know that you both have the experience in Reflection Magazine, plug. I know you've had the experience of trying to sort out your own identity in the world that is defining you differently than how you're experiencing your own life. And it seems to me that's becoming increasingly more difficult for people over the next 30, 40 years, that their own internal sense of who they are in racial, ethnic, whatever else terms, doesn't necessarily map on to what they're being told about themselves.
Well, I'm going to combine that with the question you asked previous, where, you know, we're always negotiating, and, you know, we both were like, yeah, we've learned to be white guys. Absolutely, we've learned it. You know, because sometimes, you know, I identify as an Indian American Hindu. I was raised in the South. I'm a proud Southerner, stuck in the Northeast.
That's the one that gets me.
Yes, I'm very, very proud to be from Atlanta, Georgia. And the thing is, I'm very proud to be Hindu also. And these days, you know, it's fine when I'm teaching and I want to wear my salwar kameez. You know, those are the long outfits, the pants and the tops that come down to here, or to a formal function or something, even a formal function on campus, I'll wear a sari, right? That's all well and good because it makes the university look good and they can put multicultural.
Your picture goes everywhere.
I'm always in whatever magazine from the university because I'll be out there decked out with my clothes, right? But that's one thing. But it's another thing then to be able to actually have access to the president and the board of advisors, which are the various vice presidents, and you know, do they really want to hear what I have to say there, right? So I think there is acceptance of diversity, but in certain locations, and who defines those locations depends on who has the power, and that's, you know, that's very real for me. So simply because I can get Indian food wherever I want, since I live in New Jersey, which is really nice, and I can dress however I want, and it's seen as cool and fashionable, doesn't mean that I still am not fighting my way to have my voice heard in ways that really impacts, for example, my students or the larger population in general. And that is, it takes so much energy for those of you who have to do it, right? Because it's strategy. We have to strategize as to how we're going to play it. So that's never ending. I don't think I don't know how to do that every day.
Yeah.
There were a lot of double negatives there.
Hey, your English is pretty good.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Actually, right after I finished grad school, I had a postdoc at Columbia University at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, and I was teaching my my second Asian American Studies class, and at the end of the class, a few students came up to me and they said, "Professor Joshi, we expected an accent out of you, just not a Southern one."
Well, and like I share the same experience in the sense that, you know, I have a very ethnic name. So I have, all of my life, I was born and raised in New England. So I've always had this, my teachers or faculty members or just even at work, folks would assume that I did not speak English. Or they will assume that I just came from such and such country. So it was just very hard for me growing up with an ethnic name, which I've learned to accept and embrace. But it has also been hard for me to be the first at the things that I'm doing. For example, I'm the Protestant chaplain at a New England liberal arts school, Connecticut College. And this year I had to share the invocation during commencement. So I'm here with my regalia waiting to march in, and I had a couple of board of trustee members that were looking at me like, what is she doing here? Who's this person? And when I was introduced as the chaplain, it was like, whoa, you're the chaplain? You know, and I'm like, well, what is that supposed to mean? So, you know, constantly, you know, when, you know, yes, I'm the first Latina or Protestant chaplain at a campus like that one. I'm not my 50s, you know, so it's oh, you know, so like, whoa, you look younger, you know, I thought you were one of the students. Well, thank you very much. But, you know, that idea of, the idea of being the first, you know, that has, I carrying a lot of burden in that, you know. Walking into classrooms, I could remember my friends and I at the Divinity School, we would eat down in the graduate dining hall here on campus, and we would sit down and we would look and say, wow, this building is so beautiful, but it wasn't created for people like us, you know? I mean, there were just white men at one point sitting here, and here we have just, you know, a bunch of folks of color sitting down and looking around, and you look at the pictures and you're like, whoa, I don't see anyone that looks like me. You know, what does that mean? So it's definitely has been an experience to be the first, or even to walk and carry the torch of someone who passed it to me.
On that point of not seeing people look like you, I actually remember experience of I think my first time in Morey's as a law professor and looking at the pictures on the wall. And I saw a lot of people who looked like me. I mean, I saw women, I saw men, I saw people who different shades of color, but they all looked the same in a sense. I mean, every picture looked exactly like every other picture. So that there was a strong cultural overlay that and if you were willing to fit into that picture, you could be there. And I think increasingly that's the kind of bind that we find ourselves in. I want to totally flip the conversation, though. Everyone on this panel has something to do with religion. We all manage to make a living off it one way or another. So let's talk about.
You get paid? I didn't know they
paid for this panel, Jerry. So let's talk about religion and race. I mean, if you look back historically, let's say to yesterday, I mean, you don't have to go very far. Religions have played a significant role in maintaining or justifying racial and other hierarchies. It is also the case that on occasion religions can play a role in prodding societies to dismantle racial and other hierarchies. And so, again, I'm going to try to get you guys to even the historian, to think about the future. Looking forward, what do you think will be the role of religion vis-a-vis racial hierarchy?
Howard, I think at best, at least within the larger Christian world, of which I'm most familiar, the harder, difficult questions and prodding for what it means to live out a Christian life has very deep ethical and spiritual implications that's hard for us to have a conversation about. Because we tend to talk about, in this country, we tend to talk a lot about religion almost from an ideological, political values conflict, which is important too, standpoint. But the deeper question about our common humanity and what we're called, how we're called into community with one another, and how that sense of community can undergird and nurture our core values as a democratic society without it becoming a conduit for promoting any particular religion. Those deeper questions are there. In the late 1700s, and I forget the specifics, historian, please forgive me, a very insightful slave was converted to Christianity. And he made the assumption, based on his conversion, that he was now equal to his master. And said so. And the master said, I don't think so. And there was actually, they called a conference to discuss this question. If a slave converts to Christianity, is he or she now equal to his or her white brothers? You know, and the conclusion was, yes, but only in heaven. Yeah. That the civil status of the slave remained slave, not free, but slave. The spiritual status was equal, but that equality could only be something experienced in heaven. So here you have a way in which religion then becomes one of those wheels, like culture can be rolling in an ideology that continues to oppress people. And so religion, like any ideology, could be used for good or it could be used for ill.
So this is your wheelhouse, I know that. But before you do that, this is where Tisa lives. So this is her area of expertise, so she could talk for the next day. But before, I just want to highlight a couple things that Jerry said. One, that, and he was being careful about it probably because he assumes you all are a bunch of heathens, but part of what he was suggesting is that internal to Christianity and perhaps other religions is an understanding of the self and of why we are here on planet Earth, why we exist, that can be mined to, in fact, break down various kinds of hierarchies. So that was a little piece of what he said. He also said, I mean, it's a good half of what he said. He also said, and tell me if I'm wrong, Jerry, that in this situation you're describing, where a slave became freed and thought, okay, now I'm free. I mean, became Christian rather than thought, now I'm free. And they had all this conversation about it. Yeah, you're free in heaven. So that because of the separation, see, I'm teeing this up for you, of church and state, it didn't matter what work religion was doing to to free him from the bonds of race, the state was still free to shackle him. Okay.
And that's why in the best of religion, you challenge those kind of standards.
Yes. So can you have separation of church and state and also then challenge those kinds of standards?
Well, I actually wrote about this a little bit in the essay, my essay in the Reflections magazine, if anybody wants to follow up on that topic, because I could, as you said, talk at great length. I think that this 17th century moment or 18th century moment really that you're talking about with, can slaves, if slaves convert to Christianity, then do they become equal? It was not only a moment of Christianity facilitating oppression, but it was also a moment in which racial and religious identities are clearly separated in that then, because prior to this time, there had been an assumption, and continued to be in some ways, that it was heathens who could be enslaved. And there was a connection, what we now separate out and understand as separate categories of identity, race and religion, were not clearly distinguished in that. But this kind of moment, then there's a separation between, well, okay, so slaves can be Christian, but that doesn't change their status as black and therefore enslaved and enslavable.
Right, because they were not seen as fully human.
That's right.
Because that's the objectification that goes on.
That's right. But I want to get back to the question you actually asked. I know, I don't always do that, but about
you're not paid to do that.
What role will religion play? And this may be a cop-out answer, and I'll elaborate a little bit, but I think that inevitably our religious communities will continue to be both. Unfortunately, continuing to support the status quo of racism in many ways, but at the same time will also be, at times and in certain ways, prophetic voices for change. There are signs for hope on the latter end in new attention in many faith communities to questions of racial justice and efforts to make Christian churches, I'm speaking specifically within a Christian context as well, more multiracial. We know that places of worship continue to be some of the most segregated places in general in America, and that has not changed. But there is an increasing awareness of that as a problem and a challenge. And the reason that it's a problem, segregated faith communities have sometimes been a positive resource for racial minorities. And so in themselves, in the context of a racist society, sometimes segregated faith communities have been a kind of necessary and good thing as a place for racial minorities to gain support, sustenance, spiritual sustenance.
But no one likes to live in lieu of.
That's right.
I mean, while these communities might serve cultural, historical, positive self-esteem building purposes, it's still predominantly, ethnically predominantly churches, be they black, or white, or Hispanic, or, in my opinion, across religions, that reinforce this kind of objectification of people,
yes.
the us and them,
yes.
is affront to the gods that all of them serve.
Yes.
And that's a deeper, to me, that's a deeper ethical challenge that religion in general has to face.
That's right.
And it's no one should be satisfied I love serving the Dixwell Church. They love talking about being the oldest African-American church. But I also say that as more comfortable we are about being that, we should be just as uncomfortable if this space does not signal invitation to anybody who's not in that historical tradition of an identity.
That's right.
So, and not all white people are bad.
Thank you.
We talk about white privilege, but this issue of race is a rethinking that everyone has to do.
Yes.
It's not only rethinking what we mean by black, it's rethinking what we mean by white, by both blacks and whites. And as hard as this work is, it has the potential for human flourishing on an order that we have not seen if it's done, quote, right as we move towards 2050.
And I think if I could just make one more point, I think there's a sociologist at Rice named Michael Emerson who's done a good deal of work on this question of multiracial churches, or the challenge of how churches can become more multiracial. And he argues that, he actually also has an essay in the Reflections magazine. But he argues that if the United States is to successfully tackle the problems of racism, that it has to be done at the level of churches. He is talking specifically about churches, but we could clearly broaden that out to other religious groups and faith communities more broadly. And he says, because racially segregated faith communities play a major role in setting up us-them boundaries, as you were talking about, Jerry, and the in-group and the out-group, and just the networks of who you know, and therefore what connections you can benefit from in terms of getting a job, getting all the other, then he says that it's an ethical obligation, and it's the only way that that the United States can, in fact, tackle racial justice is to get at it through religious communities. But I also think that I know. Just okay. I'll stop.
We have 11 minutes and 26 seconds.
I'll let them talk.
Kiadi.
Well, I think for a very long time, the work on race and religion has been done, continues to be done in a Christian context. Yeah. And so we're really looking at black and white in a Christian context. And I think, I think about what we need to do as Race and Religion 2.0, okay? Which is that we're gonna need to consider the Christian context, but then again, the situations. So for a Hispanic Protestant community or individual, how does that play out with an Indian American Sikh, with an Arab Muslim? All of these things are like juggling balls. Where, if you will, in one sense, when we're looking at black and white in a Christian context, you have something that's a control, if you will. I am a social scientist, so I will go back to this, but it's much more difficult when we're considering all these balls up in the air. And I think one common overlay is Christian normativity, because Christianity affects all the religions in terms of when they come here. And I'm talking about from 300 years ago to someone who landed at Newark Airport yesterday, right? Because what is considered normal in terms of the way we pray. Well, if you come with me to temple on a Monday night, you would see my mom and dad, put themselves before the deities and prostrate themselves, right? But that can kind of be seen as kind of maybe crazy or really overzealous, because the normal way of praying is to sit in a pew with your hands folded.
Not my tradition, but yes.
Right. Well, but then, right? Yes, absolutely.
I've been to Dixwell. Don't even try.
Then we get the way I envision it is really a DNA double helix, because it's the whiteness in Christianity, and that's what gets at that. Yes, not your way, of course. And so I think that is a common feature we're going to have to look at while still thinking about all these juggling balls.
So let's take your own religious background. in its connection with race in the future? What can you?
Well, so I'm Hindu, and I grew up, and I belong to a Hindu community. And I think one of the things that's going to continue to affect Hindu communities and other immigrant religious communities is migration. Yep. And is the fact that many folks who live in immigrant communities live transnational lives, right? So in my case, there is more than one place I call home. I call Atlanta, Georgia home. I call Ahmedabad, India home. I'm still working on calling New Jersey home, but I'll get there, but I'll get there. But so, how does travel back and forth, family members travel back and forth, impact how Hinduism? In my case, it's impacted tremendously. I grew up going to India every summer. I had no choice. School's out. Parents shipped me over, And of course, I'm very thankful that they did because I'm fluent in Gujarati and everything. But 3 months out of the year, I would see how Hinduism is lived in India, which is very different than how Hinduism is lived in the United States. Because there, if Diwali falls on Thursday, everybody's got Thursday off. Over here, when Diwali falls on Thursday, I'm canceling class. I'm explaining to my students why they have to come another week, right? It's that Christian norm. I'm trying to make my way within that. And my students understand, but how many students want to come during exam week for an extra class? So I can see why hostility can be built up.
Other religious communities have done and have to do that in America, as you know.
Absolutely. So for me, it's this, it's this constant negotiation. But I think transnationalism is really going to continue to affect how religious communities form in the United States.
And there's the transnationalism, people going back and forth, but the immigration piece strikes me as has the potential to keep seeding the changing American scene with.
Well, yes, because right now, for example, we have, since the 1970s, Hindu temples all across the United States, very majestic temples done in South Indian architectural styles. Right. And the thing is all of this blood, sweat, and tears was put in by the immigrants who came over post-1965. Yeah. They worked like anything to build these structures, in most part for their children. And now, the second generation, they're not going. They're not going to the temples. What's populating them is the constant migration.
Exactly.
So we have to see how that's going to last and what kind of impact there's going to be. But what we also know is while second generation Hindus and Sikhs, for example, aren't necessarily going to houses of worship, they are trying to figure out how Hinduism or how Sikhism or even how Islam lives in their lives. They want it. But they're struggling. But that's probably a different panel. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
Well,
I was trying to lead you there.
3 years ago, I had the privilege of sitting down with a couple to be married. And we worked on this ceremony for a whole year. And the reason for that intensity is because the groom was a first-generation Muslim Pakistani, and the bride was a first-generation Korean born-again Christian. And besides meeting with them, we also had to meet with family. I walked away from that experience more hopeful than exhausted, but I was exhausted.
I'm sure you were.
In that they did the kind of negotiating. They were educating both the bride and groom was educating their family and their parents about why they made the choice of a mate that they had made, and how they were going to accommodate the religious values that were core to both families. And it became a wonderful learning and also growing experience for everyone. They're happily married. They just had their first child a year ago. And I think a lot of this is going on in pocket places that's going to have an impact, along with the pushback of the normative stuff that all of us have to deal with. And I think it's going on in white communities too. White communities are not just sitting back trying to wait to see what the verdict is going to be. They're struggling with trying to figure out what it means to be a part of this larger mix of what we are trying to profile as the future.
Arcelis, you begged me not to go first, so you get to go last.
I think it's just important that we even consider listening to the children and listening to the young generation, specifically in our faith communities. They have so much to give, and within my community, familia is something that's embraced. And what does it mean to be in a community where it's multi-generational, multi-ethnic, and cultural, and allowing there to be a space for our children to worship in their way and in their and how they want to do that, and allow there to be the traditional way for the older and those who may want that experience. But at times that can be difficult. I know, again, in my experience, it's the language. The younger generation wants to worship in English, so that becomes like, oh, that's different. So I think it's, I know that it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of work, but I am hopeful, and I believe that that we just need to continue to listen and be open to change.
Harlan, I did want to also say that we can't ignore, we should be mindful of the impact of China and other parts of Asia on America, on South America, and on Africa. And the ways in which I have a number of African American friends with this internationalism you talked about, living in the United States, work in China, back and forth, and there's now this developing relationship between American people, African Americans, and Chinese. And so that's another part of the mix, along with immigration. I just want to know.
No. Sitting in the front row is Mary Lou Oleski, who's the grand poobah of Arts and Ideas. And Are You Listening? What an interesting idea for a panel, the impact of China and its rise as an intergalactic power on American racial and other relations. This conversation can continue. You all have been very kind to listen in on us talk. But there is... we'd love to hear your thoughts on any of these subjects and more. And so to participate in an online discussion, I think you all have the same cheat sheet I do. There's a link here that you can enter into your web browser, or there's a QR code, and if you don't know what that is, ask someone younger than you are. And visit the comment page for this event, and I'll train our panelists on how to do it. Maybe we can be part of that same ongoing conversation as well. Jerry and Tisa and Kiati and Arcelis, thank you so much. This has been a delight, and the conversation continues. Thank you.